The first time Julianne saw him, he was stacking boxes of canned goods with quiet precision, his broad shoulders flexing under the weight. He wasn't like the usual volunteers at the food bank. Most were chatty, filling the space with small talk and laughter. But this man? He worked in silence, focused, his dark hair slightly tousled, as if he had run a hand through it one too many times. Julianne shook off her curiosity and turned back to her task, sorting bags of rice into smaller portions. She had been volunteering at the neighborhood food bank for almost a year now, and new faces came and went all the time. Whoever he was, he'd probably be gone by next week. Still, there was something about him. At the end of the shift, as she wiped her hands on her jeans, she noticed him standing by the door, rolling down his sleeves. He glanced at her, and for the first time, their eyes met. His were a deep, piercing blue, holding an intensity that sent a strange flutter through her chest. "Good work today," he said, his voice smooth but low, like he wasn't used to small talk. Julianne smiled, surprised he had spoken to her. "You too? First time volunteering?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yeah. Just wanted to help out." There was a slight roughness in his voice, like he wasn't used to explaining himself. She tilted her head. "Well, welcome. I'm Julianne." He seemed to consider her for a moment before saying, "Brendan." She extended a hand, and when his large, warm palm enveloped hers, a strange electricity passed between them. Julianne pulled back quickly, ignoring the heat that rushed to her face. "Well, Brendan, hope to see you around," she said, grabbing her coat. His lips twitched almost a smile, but he didn't say anything as she walked out. Brendan found himself coming back the next week. And the next. He told himself it was because the work was fulfilling, something different from the boardrooms and high-stakes meetings that consumed his life. But deep down, he knew the real reason. Julianne. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met. She was warm, open, laughing easily with the other volunteers, treating every person who came through the food bank with kindness and dignity. She had no idea who he was, and for the first time in years, Brendan felt like just another man, not Brendan Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Enterprises, billionaire investor, and one of New York's most influential figures. Just Brendan. And he liked that. One evening, as they were stacking crates of fresh produce, Julianne nudged him with her elbow. "You're getting good at this." He chuckled. "Are you saying I was bad before?" She grinned. "I'm saying you had the posture of a man who's never lifted anything heavier than a briefcase." Brendan smirked, but she wasn't wrong. He was used to power lunches and high-rise offices, not unloading trucks in a dusty warehouse. But he found himself enjoying it more than he ever expected. "So, what do you do outside of this?" she asked, tossing an apple into a crate. Brendan hesitated. He had been careful not to reveal too much about his life. He liked the way Julianne looked at him without expectation, without calculation. "I work in finance," he said vaguely. It wasn't a lie. Julianne nodded. "That makes sense. You have the look of a businessman." He raised a brow. "What does that mean?" She shrugged. "You're too put together. Like you walked out of a magazine ad for expensive suits." Brendan laughed, a real, deep laugh that surprised even him. "Noted." Julianne studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Well, whoever you are, I'm glad you're here." Something in his chest tightened. He was in trouble. A few weeks later, a winter storm hit, and the food bank was short on volunteers. Julianne and Brendan worked late, distributing supplies to families in need. By the time they finished, the streets were covered in snow, and Julianne shivered as she pulled her coat tighter. Brendan noticed immediately. "Let me drive you home." She waved him off. "I'll be fine. The subway's still running." He frowned. "Julianne, it's freezing." She hesitated, then finally nodded. "All right. Thanks." When she slid into his car, she blinked. "Wow. This is nice." Brendan cursed silently. His sleek black Aston Martin wasn't exactly subtle. He had intended to borrow one of his company's more understated cars, but in his rush, he had grabbed his usual. Julianne ran a hand over the leather seats. This must have cost a fortune. He kept his expression neutral. I like cars. She laughed. I'll say. As he drove, Julianne leaned back, sighing. Tonight was tough, but I'm glad we stayed. Some of those families really needed it. Brendan glanced at her, an admiration growing in his chest. You do this every week. Why? She turned to him, her expression softening. Because I know what it's like to struggle. He hadn't expected that. My mom raised me and my sister alone. She continued. There were times when we barely had enough to get by. Places like the food bank helped us. So now, I want to help others. Brendan gripped the wheel tighter. He had grown up in a world of privilege, never knowing what it was like to worry about the next meal. Hearing her story made him see her in a whole new light. When they reached her apartment, Julianne turned to him. Thanks for the ride, Brendan. And for everything else. Her gaze lingered on his for a moment too long. He knew he should say goodnight. Knew he should walk away before he did something reckless. But then she smiled, and something inside him snapped. Julianne, he said, his voice rough. She tilted her head. Yeah? Before he could second-guess himself, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, they just stared at each other, the air between them charged. Then, just as quickly, Brendan pulled back. Good night, he said, his voice huskier than before. Julianne blinked, clearly affected, but she nodded. Good night, Brendan. As she stepped out, Brendan exhaled, gripping the wheel. He was falling. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could stop. Brendan had spent years perfecting the art of control of his company, his emotions, his public image. But ever since he met Julianne, that control had started to slip. He found himself looking forward to the days he volunteered, counting the hours until he could see her again. It was absurd. He was a man who made billion-dollar decisions before breakfast, yet a single glance from Julianne had the power to unravel him. The problem was, he wasn't sure what to do about it. One evening, he arrived at the food bank earlier than usual. The winter air was sharp, the sky painted in deep hues of purple and indigo. Inside, Julianne was already there, rolling up the sleeves of her sweater as she stacked cans onto a shelf. She turned as he stepped in. You're early today. He shrugged. Needed a break from work. Julianne studied him for a second, then gestured toward the crates. Well, if you're looking for a distraction, we just got a huge donation. Think you can handle lifting a few things? Brendan took off his coat and rolled up his sleeves. Try me. They worked side by side, an easy rhythm forming between them. At one point, Julianne reached for a box at the same time he did, and their fingers brushed. She pulled back quickly, but not before he saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Neither of them said anything about it. After the shift, they lingered outside, their breath visible in the cold. Julianne rubbed her arms. I always forget how quiet the city gets at night. Brendan glanced at her. You like that? She nodded. There's something peaceful about it. Like for a little while, everything slows down. He understood that feeling more than he cared to admit. The world he lived in never stopped. It was meetings, deals, headlines. But here, with her, there was silence. A kind of stillness he hadn't realized he was missing. Julianne turned to face him fully. So, what's your story? Brendan tensed. What do you mean? She smiled. You show up here every week, work harder than most of the regulars, and yet you dodge questions about yourself. You said you work in finance, but that's pretty vague. He hesitated. He had been careful not to reveal too much. But Julianne had a way of looking at him like she could see past the walls he had spent years building. I run a company, he finally said. She raised a brow. Big company? He exhaled, knowing there was no way around it. Caldwell Enterprises. Julianne stared at him, the name clearly registering. He braced himself for the shift, for the change that always came when people realized who he was. But instead of awe or calculation, she let out a short laugh. Wow! And here I thought you were just a guy who liked expensive cars. Brendan blinked. You're not surprised? Oh, I'm surprised, Julianne admitted. But I guess it makes sense. You've got that whole serious businessman energy. He wasn't sure whether to be relieved or frustrated. That's it. No questions about money or power? Julianne crossed her arms. Brendan, I don't care how much money you have. You're still the guy who stacks cans and volunteers his time. That's who I've been getting to know. Something inside him loosened. He had braced for a reaction, but he hadn't expected this. Julianne glanced at him. So why do this? You could write a check and call it a day. Brendan considered his answer. Because I wanted something real. She held his gaze, and for a moment, the space between them felt charged. Then, with a small smile, she said, Well, you picked the right place. That night, as Brendan watched Julianne disappear into her apartment building, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just falling for her. He was already gone. Brendan had spent years negotiating billion-dollar deals, facing off against ruthless competitors, and navigating the merciless world of high finance. And yet, standing in Julianne's modest apartment for the first time, he felt more out of his element than ever before. She had invited him in after their shift, offering him a cup of tea to warm up from the biting cold outside. He had hesitated for only a moment before accepting, knowing full well that if he walked away now, he'd regret it. The space was small but cozy, filled with mismatched furniture that somehow worked together perfectly. A blanket was draped across the back of the couch, a few well-worn books stacked on the coffee table. It was nothing like the sterile, modern luxury of his penthouse. This place had warmth. Life. Julianne handed him a steaming mug, then sat across from him, curling her legs beneath her. Her gaze flickered over him, studying him in a way that made his pulse quicken. So, she said, her voice light but curious. What's it like? Brendan raised a brow. What's what like? Your world, she clarified. The private jets, the skyscrapers with your name on them, the people who probably say yes to you before you even finish a sentence. He exhaled, setting his cup down. Exhausting, he admitted. That answer seemed to surprise her. I thought you'd say exciting. It used to be, he said. In the beginning, when I was building Caldwell Enterprises, when every deal felt like a victory. But at some point, it stopped being about the win and started being about the expectation. Julianne tilted her head slightly. Expectation? Brendan nodded. People expect me to be relentless. To always be ahead, always expanding, always making the next move. It never stops. She was quiet for a moment, seeming to absorb his words. That sounds lonely, she finally said. The honesty of her observation caught him off guard. He had spent years surrounded by people, advisors, investors, competitors, yet she was right. It was lonely. Julianne watched him closely. Then why keep going? He hesitated before answering. Because I don't know how to stop. The words felt heavier than he had expected. She didn't push, didn't offer hollow reassurances. Instead, she took a sip of her tea, letting the silence settle comfortably between them. Brendan had never experienced anything quite like this before. No agendas. No calculated conversations. Just being. And it terrified him. As the night stretched on, the conversation drifted into easier topics: travel, favorite books, childhood memories. He learned that Julianne had always wanted to see Italy, that she had a weakness for old black and white films, and that she made a mean homemade soup, though she warned him never to ask her to bake. I once set an entire batch of cookies on fire, she confessed with a laugh. It was supposed to be a simple recipe. Brendan found himself chuckling, the sound foreign even to his own ears. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed like this, without reservation or pretense. As the clock neared midnight, Brendan reluctantly stood. I should go. Julianne followed him to the door, her expression unreadable. "Thanks for the tea," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Any time," she replied. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them thickened, charged with something unspoken yet undeniable. Brendan knew he should leave. Knew that crossing this invisible line could change everything. But then Julianne shifted slightly closer, and it was enough to tip the balance. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers grazing her cheek. She didn't pull away. His pulse thundered. "Julianne!" Her lips parted slightly, her breath shallow. Everything in him screamed to close the distance, to finally give in to what had been building between them from the start. And yet, with a sharp inhale, he took a step back. Julianne blinked, clearly surprised. Brendan clenched his fists at his sides. "Good night, Julianne." Then he turned and walked out the door before he lost the last shred of control he had left. The next morning, Brendan sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had barely slept. His mind was a battlefield, warring between logic and the undeniable pull he felt toward Julianne. A knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. His assistant Daniel stepped in. "Sir, the investors from London are waiting on your call." Brendan nodded, rubbing his temples. "Give me 5 minutes." Daniel hesitated. "If I may, sir." "You seem distracted." Brendan exhaled through his nose. "I'm fine." Daniel didn't look convinced, but he nodded and left the room. Brendan leaned back in his chair, pressing his hands together. He was in deep. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure how to navigate his next move. Brendan had closed countless deals, built an empire from the ground up, and faced ruthless competitors without flinching. But standing outside Julianne's apartment building, his heart pounded in a way that no boardroom negotiation ever had. It had been 3 days since he walked away from her, 3 days of battling the growing ache inside him. He had tried to bury himself in work, drowning in reports and meetings, but it was useless. Every thought led back to her. The way she laughed, the warmth in her eyes, the quiet strength she carried in everything she did. And he was done pretending he could ignore it. Taking a steadying breath, he stepped inside and climbed the narrow staircase to her door. He had never been nervous before, not in business, not in life, but now, with each step, anticipation coiled tight in his chest. When he knocked, he heard the faint shuffle of movement before the door swung open. Julianne stood there, her expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. She was barefoot, wrapped in a thick sweater, her hair pulled into a loose knot. Despite the simplicity, she was the most breathtaking thing he had ever seen. She didn't speak at first, just studied him, searching his face for the reason he was here. "I couldn't stay away," Brendan admitted, his voice low. Julianne's fingers tightened on the edge of the door. "You walked away." "I know." Guilt flickered in his chest. "And I regret it." She folded her arms, as if trying to guard herself. "Why did you?" "Because I was scared. Because you make me feel things I don't know how to control. Because for the first time in my life, I don't have a plan." None of those words made it past his lips. Instead, he stepped forward. "Because I've spent my whole life believing love was a distraction. And then I met you, and suddenly, nothing else mattered." A flicker of emotion crossed her face, something fragile and hopeful. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice rough. "But I want to try. With you." Julianne's breath hitched. For a long, agonizing moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Okay," she whispered. Relief crashed through him, so overwhelming it nearly stole his breath. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, silently promising her everything he hadn't been able to say. She smiled, and just like that, the ache inside him eased. Brendan had always believed that love and business were opposites, one built on emotion, the other on strategy. But with Julianne, he was learning that love was its own kind of power. He found himself carving out time in ways he never had before. Late night walks through the city, stolen moments in between meetings, quiet dinners in her tiny apartment where she teased him about his inability to cook anything that didn't require a personal chef. It was new. It was terrifying. And it was everything. One evening, as they sat on her couch, her legs tucked beneath her, she glanced at him with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I think I liked you better before I knew you were a billionaire." Brendan raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" She grinned. "You were more mysterious. Just a guy stacking cans in a food bank." He chuckled. "I could go back to being mysterious if you'd like." Julianne leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "No," she murmured. "I like you like this. The real you." Something in his chest tightened. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. No one had ever seen him the way she did. Not as a CEO, not as a name in the papers, but as a man. And he never wanted to lose that. Brendan had never been one for grand romantic gestures. He had always viewed them as unnecessary, something meant for fairy tales and movies. But as he stood in the middle of a quiet Italian restaurant, the entire place reserved just for them, he realized he had never wanted anything more than to give Julianne the world. She walked in, her eyes widening at the candlelit tables, the soft music playing in the background. "Brendan," she breathed. "What is this?" He stepped forward, taking her hands. "You told me you always wanted to see Italy," he said. "I figured this was the next best thing." Emotion flickered across her face. "You did all this for me?" He cupped her face, brushing his thumb along her cheek. "I'd do anything for you." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she smiled, reaching up to press a kiss to his lips. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise. A beginning. And Brendan knew, without a doubt, that he had found the one thing he had never known he was searching for. Her. Brendan had been in high-stakes negotiations before, but none had ever mattered as much as the moment he stood before Julianne's tiny kitchen table, watching her fiddle with the edge of her napkin. He had taken her to private dinners, driven her through the city in his expensive car, and even arranged a perfect Italian-themed evening just for her. But here, in this quiet apartment, under the soft glow of her mismatched lamps, was where everything felt real. And tonight, he was going to tell her exactly what she meant to him. Julianne glanced up at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're staring." Brendan exhaled, leaning forward. "I have something to ask you." She arched a brow, clearly intrigued. "I want you to come with me to the Caldwell Foundation Gala this weekend." Her fingers stilled. "The Caldwell Foundation? My company's philanthropic division," he explained. "It's an annual event to honor the charities we support, raise funds, and recognize the people making a difference." His gaze held hers. "People like you." Julianne's mouth parted slightly, but she quickly shook her head. "Brendan, I don't belong at something like that." He leaned forward, his voice steady. "You belong more than anyone." She let out a breath, clearly thinking. "I don't know anything about high society galas." "You know about helping people," he countered. "That's all that matters." She hesitated, then finally nodded. "All right." Brendan's chest eased. He hadn't realized how much he had wanted her to say yes until now. The night of the gala arrived, and Brendan waited at Julianne's door, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit. When she finally stepped out, he felt the air leave his lungs. She wore an elegant midnight blue gown, the fabric flowing around her like liquid silk. It was simple, understated, yet breathtaking. And yet, it wasn't the dress that made his chest tighten, it was the way she looked at him, a mix of nerves and quiet excitement. "You're stunning," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Julianne let out a small laugh. "I still don't feel like I belong at something like this." Brendan extended his hand, his gaze unwavering. "Then let me prove you wrong." She placed her hand in his, and he led her downstairs to the waiting car. The gala was held in a grand ballroom, with chandeliers casting a golden glow over elegantly dressed guests. Servers weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and a string quartet played softly in the background. Julianne's fingers tightened slightly around Brendan's arm as they stepped inside. He bent close to her ear. Breathe. She exhaled, then nodded. Almost immediately, a group of executives and investors approached, offering polite greetings and expectant glances toward Julianne. She met them with quiet grace, responding with warmth but never pretending to be someone she wasn't. As the night went on, Brendan found himself watching her more than anything else. She had walked into his world, a world of wealth, power, and carefully calculated appearances, yet she remained entirely herself. When the time came for Brendan to take the stage and give his speech, he felt something shift inside him. He had spoken at hundreds of events before, but tonight, as he looked across the room and found Julianne's gaze, this speech felt different. He cleared his throat. We often measure success in numbers, profits, stock values, expansion. But real success, the kind that lasts, is measured in impact. He let his eyes drift toward Julianne. It's measured in the lives we touch, the hands we lift, the kindness we show when no one is watching. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, but Brendan didn't care about their reactions. He only cared about one. Julianne's eyes shone with something he couldn't quite name, and when he stepped down from the stage, she met him at the bottom of the stairs. You didn't have to say all that, she murmured. He reached for her hand. Yes, I did. She swallowed, her fingers curling around his. Dance with me, he said. She hesitated, then nodded. Brendan led her to the center of the ballroom as the music slowed to a soft melody. He placed one hand at her waist, the other holding hers, and they moved together in perfect rhythm. Julianne exhaled a quiet laugh. You're full of surprises. He brushed his thumb over her knuckles. You have no idea. For a long moment, they simply swayed, lost in the music, the world around them fading. Then, in a voice low and steady, Brendan said, I love you. Julianne stilled. He had never said those words to anyone before. Had never allowed himself to feel them. But with her, there was no fear. No hesitation. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. And then, with the kind of certainty that sent his heart racing, she whispered, I love you too. Brendan exhaled, his grip tightening, pulling her closer. This wasn't just another moment. This was the beginning of forever. Brendan had always been a man who controlled outcomes. He shaped the future with careful precision, ensuring every move he made was deliberate, every choice calculated. But with Julianne, nothing had been planned. She had walked into his life like a quiet storm, unraveling the carefully laid order of his world, and for the first time, he welcomed the chaos. In the weeks following the gala, their lives intertwined in ways he never expected. Julianne became more than just the woman he loved, she became his safe harbor, the one person who saw him beyond the wealth and power, beyond the expectations. She challenged him, grounded him, and most of all, reminded him of what truly mattered. One evening, as they walked through a quiet park, the city lights flickering in the distance, Brendan felt the weight of a realization settle deep in his chest. This was what he had been missing. Not the next deal, not the next acquisition, this. The simple, undeniable joy of being with someone who made him feel whole. Julianne turned to him, her breath visible in the cool air. You're quiet tonight. He laced his fingers through hers, pulling her closer. I've been thinking. She tilted her head, waiting. Brendan exhaled, his voice steady. I've spent my life chasing success, believing that happiness was something to be earned after everything else was in place. But I was wrong. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. Happiness is this. You. Her eyes softened, and she squeezed his hand. Brendan. Before she could say more, he reached into his pocket, his heart pounding in a way it never had before. Julianne's breath hitched as he dropped to one knee, the world around them falling into silence. I don't want a life where you're just a part of it, Brendan said, his voice rough with emotion. I want a life where you are the center of it. Where every morning starts with you, and every night ends with you. He opened the small velvet box, revealing a ring that caught the glow of the streetlights. Marry me. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't hesitate. Yes. Relief crashed through him as he slid the ring onto her finger, then rose to pull her into his arms. She wrapped around him effortlessly, her laughter warm against his skin. Brendan had built an empire, but this was his greatest victory. A year later, the world knew Julianne Caldwell not as a socialite, not as a billionaire's wife, but as a force in her own right. Together, she and Brendan expanded the Caldwell Foundation, funding programs that provided resources for struggling families. The food bank where they had met received the largest donation in its history, allowing it to expand its reach tenfold. Their wedding had been an elegant yet intimate affair, attended by those who truly mattered. Brendan had insisted on sparing no expense, but Julianne had grounded the event in what was most important: love, family, and the life they were building together. Now, as they stood on the terrace of their home, overlooking the city that had brought them together, Brendan pulled Julianne against his chest, breathing her in. She sighed contentedly. "Did you ever think your life would turn out like this?" He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Not in a million years." Julianne turned in his arms, her fingers tracing along his jaw. "Are you happy?" Brendan caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Beyond anything I ever imagined." And as the city lights shimmered below them, Brendan knew one thing with absolute certainty: he had found everything he had ever been searching for. And he was never letting go.